Hello everyone, welcome back to my subscribers and welcome to any newcomers. I'm Redbeard and my channel is focused on bringing you content for Total War Warhammer 3, with a focus on theory crafting, at least for now. For today we have the first episode in a new series, focused on potential race packs we may or may not see in the future. Though this first race is basically a guarantee, maybe even before this year closes. In this series, we will discuss everything from legendary characters, starting positions, units, mechanics, and more. For some races, we may have to make some educated guesses. Others have plenty of material to speculate from as is. For any sections on lore, I will most likely just read excerpts from any books, army books, or otherwise, that pertain to giving credibility to my theories. I will also take into account things the community would like to see using sources like mods and forums. By the time this series closes, I intend to detail 7 unique races to fill out the race selection screen. I may do a bonus race or 2 after that, but we will see. Without further ado, today's video is on Chaos Dwarves. It's been pretty obvious for a while that the CD will be the next DLC, which is why we will cover them first. For those uninitiated, the Chaos Dwarves are basically evil dwarves. The dwarves suffer from lack of cavalry, monsters, and magic, and the Chaos Dwarves have none of those problems. Now, to overview the mechanics and playstyle of the race. The first and most obvious mechanic for the CD is slaves. Now, I think the easiest and most efficient way to implement this is to copy and paste the Dark Elf slaves mechanic. In Warhammer 3, the Druchii got a nerf to this mechanic with slave diktats, and a limit of 600 slaves at a time. You can now spend your slaves on diktats or rights as before in Game 2. Personally, I think 600 is really low, and I would like it to be 1,000 instead, but I do think the nerf was necessary. Now, as for whatever reason, Game 1 and 3 races never had any rights, which, by the way, it's almost 2023, ECA. Give my 1 and 3 boys their rights. Am I right? Anyways, perhaps they would get a race mechanic. Let's call it the Blessings of Hashut, and could even use a similar UI to Kislev's Motherland mechanic, but would also have effects closer to the Dark Elves' rights, so it could use that UI panel. They could give it a unique UI as well, I'm just saying it would be similar in effect. This would make sense as the Chaos Dwarves would not exist without the Blessings of Hashut, and it gives them somewhere to spend their slaves besides the diktats. Largely, the effects of the Dark Elf rights, just swap a couple names around. Switch the Black Arkwright for Iron Demon, which I see as a unit like Queen Bess, not a moving settlement. Though it is hard to say exactly how the Iron Demon will be implemented, but more on that in the Unix section. To represent the lore of the Iron Demon, originally designed for mining excavations, I added in 10% resource gathering for anyone willing to do trade with the Dawizar. Switch the Sorceress rights for Sorcerer Prophets and Demon Smiths, the Magic Lord and Hero options for Chaos Dwarves, but again, more on them later. The Slave right can largely stay the same, just change the Dark Conduit to a CD-inspired army ability, which I named Volcanic Fury here. Then the Faction Stability right makes enough sense. The Dawizar have some very infamous Black Orc rebellions, so having the right makes sense. By extension, having the loyalty mechanic that several other races have makes sense too, even though it can be pretty annoying. Besides Dark Elf mechanics, Dawizar hold grudges and craft runes, just like the Dawi. Now, the Great Book of Grudges mechanic I think doesn't fit the CD as well as it does their cousins. Besides that, from what I've seen in the lore, there is no equivalent Great Book for the Chaos Dwarves. Rune crafting, on the other hand, I think fits like a glove. Just give the items a bit of a Chaos Dwarf flavored, names and effects, and voila. Black Iron Watchtowers also exist in and around the borders of the Darklands and could act similar to Empire Forts or High Elf Gates. They could be placed along the passes leading from the World's Edge Mountains or Mountains of Morn to the north at Uskalak or along the southern border of the Desolation of Asgore. This makes sense strategically as the Chaos Dwarves may have enemies like the Ogre Kingdoms, who also could be allies, but the Old World Dwarves or Undead or possibly Imric or Kugath or Helmengorst. Now, there could be a mechanic involving arms dealing and trains. So there are trains that run throughout the Darklands that transport different resources. Now, maybe they could use this mechanic to transport armies throughout the Darklands. It wouldn't extend outside of the Darklands, it would just be solely within the Darklands. So perhaps only the legendary lords like Astrogoth or Drazoth the Ashen could use this, but I'll get more into lords later. And any lords that exist within the race that start outside of the Darklands don't get the train mechanic, but they are arms dealers, so they could have a similar mechanic to caravans from Cathay. So let's say you send out a small army that's, called a arms dealing expedition, and you sell mostly to chaos armies, but also possibly to Vampire Coast or Dogs of War if they come, or maybe something, some other faction. Maybe you could sell slaves besides weapons too, and depending on what the product is, you might get certain amounts more money. Just exactly how the caravans work. As far as the lore stands, a slave mechanic, a loyalty mechanic, rune crafting mechanic, blessings of Hashut mechanic, possibly train and arms dealing mechanics, those should cover the gamut. Since it's a DLC race, they might want to add more new and unique mechanics additionally, or kind of flavors of existing mechanics. Please tell me in the comments what mechanics you think the Dawizar should or should not have, or possibly what legendary lord should have certain unique mechanics dedicated to them and what those might be. As far as how the race will play on the battlefield, not gonna lie, I think they have the potential to become the most uber Chad race in the game. I mean, they have everything the regular dwarves have in highly armored, sturdy early and late game infantry. On top of that, they have more powerful artillery, which is their cousin's main strength. Besides that, they have cheap chaff, cavalry, monsters, and magic. Everything the old world dwarves don't. The Chaos Dwarves may have an overly rounded roster, to be quite frank. If the Dawizar roster fills out the way it rightfully should, though, everyone's going to fear them, and they're going to be really, really powerful to play. The real offset and counter to that overly rounded roster, though, is that I expect that every Chaos Dwarf unit is going to be very expensive, forcing you to rely on keeping slaves in your armies. So, my thoughts are, if you, early game, you own one province, and none of those settlements are above tier 3, then you should not be able to afford a full stack of Chaos Dwarves. Maybe you can afford, half a stack of Chaos Dwarves, and the rest being all slaves. So you can still afford a stack, but again, mostly going to be slaves at that point in the game. Now, before we get into the actual unit roster, let's talk about mechanics as far as it applies to units themselves. So, special rules. The three main ones being Resolute, Relentless, and Contempt. So for the army special rules, firstly we have Contempt. All the Chaos Dwarves, Machine Crews, Bull Centaurs, and Lamassu, and etc. would have this attribute. Basically, if any units without this rule route near a unit with this rule, the unit with this rule would not suffer a leadership debuff. In layman's terms, all units without this rule are effectively expendable to those with it. Units with the Relentless rule might start with Fresh Vigor if the army is caught in march stance and forced to battle. Another way this could work is that these units may have Perfect Vigor for the first 30 seconds of melee combat, or perhaps even another way it could work is that these units could only fatigue in combat and not from movement. Tell me in the comments what you think. The Shield Wall rule could probably just act as Chaos Dwarf units receiving Expert Charge Defense, and some receiving Charge Reflection. Hobgoblins had rules such as Sneakin' and Backstab and Cowardly Despoilers that essentially could all boil down to one rule, similar to Devastating Flankers from Slaanesh. However, if they are charged alternatively, they get a leadership debuff, let's say a -15. The Sorcerer's Curse rule means that all casters take double damage from miscasts, because dwarves' physiology. They are not supposed to be casting magic, but chaos dwarves are special, but at a cost. So again, I think that works as maybe at miscast you take double damage. The Blazing Body rule is basically a Mortis Engine effect with fire damage. The Burning Bright rule is losing health constantly from the start of battle. Now that rule might not translate very well to Total War, but I think a mixing of the Blazing Body and Burning Bright rule into a toggleable ability may be the way to go. Accompanied with the Chaos Dwarf race and their Sorcerer Prophets will assuredly be a unique lore of magic known as the Lore of Hashut. It is a sub-lore of Akshi, the Red Wind, known as the Lore of Fire. We could talk about each spell's tabletop rules, but instead I've translated it to how I think they will work in Total War. Also, CA always removes a spell from the tabletop rules. In tabletop there are usually 7, while Total War has 6, and both have a lore attribute. Tell me in the comments which spell you would remove. My vote would be Dark Subjugation, as it is the least unique in my opinion. For our lore attribute, we have Killing Fire, which I believe would make enemies map-wide become flammable for roughly 20 seconds. Though CA may want to localize it so that this only affects enemies taking the spell damage. Next, we have Breath of Hatred, which in tabletop would have given friendly troops the Hatred rule. Translated to Total War, this might give the affected troops increased melee attack and weapon strength with flaming attacks, but this makes them rampage. It can be overcast to affect more than one unit, with an increase of Winds of Magic cost from 6 to 12. This would be the signature, or default spell, that all casters of the Lore of Hashut would begin with. Burning Wrath would be a magic missile in the vein of Fireball, or Blue Fires of Tzeentch. It can be overcast, which perhaps would give it extra projectiles or increased damage or accuracy. This would increase the Winds of Magic cost from 6 to 12. Dark Subjugation is your classic debuff hex that bombs out a single unit's leadership, such as Doom and Darkness. Unbreakable units would be immune. It costs 8 winds and cannot be overcast. Curse of Hashut is a direct damage spell similar to Spirit Leech, meant to be used on single entities. All of its damage would ignore armor, and it may reduce speed. It would cost 10 winds of magic, and cannot be overcast. Ash Storm would have a variety of effects, chiefly causing the blinded contact effect. This reduces melee attack and defense by -24 and accuracy by -30 for the duration. A unit affected by this spell would be unable to charge, sprint, or fly, and would treat all terrain as rough. To simplify this myriad of movement effects, it may just reduce speed. Lastly, spellcasters under the effects of this spell would be unable to cast for the duration. In tabletop, it also caused the affected units to be flammable, but I find this redundant against the Killing Fire lore attribute. This spell may only affect one unit, but I would prefer to see it as a small AoE. It would cost 12 winds of magic. For the heavy hitters, we have Hellhammer and Flames of Asgore. The Lore of Fire has a wind spell with Burning Head and a moving vortex with Flamestorm. The Lore of Tzeentch has moving vortexes with Tzeentch's Firestorm and a stationary vortex with Infernal Gateway. The Lore of Hashut would have a direct damage spell in the Flames of Asgore and a hybrid wind and explosion spell in Hellhammer. Let's go into Flames of Asgore first, because it's more straightforward in how it works. It would be a direct damage spell similar to Final Transmutation or Flock of Doom, but would focus on magical and flaming damage with maybe a modicum of armor-piercing damage. It would cost 18 winds, or 25 if overcast. It may have some sort of bubbling, bursting lava animation, making it more akin to a stationary vortex. Lastly, we have Hellhammer, which could possibly be the most unique. It would follow Lash of Slaanesh, which is technically a breath attack in a cone shape, but functions as several small explosion spells. I think Hellhammer would be a wind spell, but would act as a series of explosions in the same vein. Imagine the impact of the Ogre's Bone Crusher spell, coupled with the flaming damage and trajectory of Burning Head. Here is a rough illustration of how I think it should function. It would have 4 explosions, and 13 winds of magic cost. Overcasted, it would have 6 explosions at 18 winds of magic. So that about covers all the general mechanics we might expect from a Chaos Dwarf race pack. I originally was going to make one video covering lore mechanics, lords, roster, and more, but it would have been roughly 2 hours long. So I've split what I've been working on for the last few weeks into a handful of videos all focused on Chaos Dwarves. First was lore, now mechanics, and next will be units or lords, whichever I finish first, so stay tuned for that. I'd say I've put more work into these Chaos Dwarf videos than anything I've produced thus far for this channel. On top of that, I've been working with the assembly kit to make my starting armies mod, whilst also attempting to learn scripting to make more compatible mods. All that being said, I have to go to my actual job to pay bills, which is why the content on the channel has been a little slow recently. I am working, though, don't you fret. So if you want to support myself and my content in these pursuits, please like, comment, subscribe, share my videos, and don't forget to hit the bell notification so you don't miss any of my uploads. I'm Redbeard, and I hope y'all have a wonderful day.